The sun was barely rising over the Colorado Territory when Jake Morrison found her lying beside the railroad tracks, bloodied and unconscious. The pregnant woman's dress was torn, her face bruised, and her breathing shallow. Most men would have ridden past, but Jake had never been most men. He was a cowboy, barely scraping by, working odd jobs to keep his small ranch from going under. The last thing he needed was another mouth to feed, especially someone carrying a child. But as he knelt beside her broken form, something stirred in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since losing his own family years ago. He gathered her into his arms and carried her home, not knowing that saving her life would change everything. What he didn't realize was that the woman he'd rescued wasn't just any drifter, and the people who threw her from that train would stop at nothing to finish what they started. But would Jake's growing feelings for her be enough to protect them both when her dangerous past finally caught up? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake Morrison had always been a man of few words and fewer possessions, but what he lacked in worldly goods, he made up for in character. His weathered hands, scarred from years of hard labor, trembled slightly as he carried the unconscious woman across the threshold of his modest cabin. The structure wasn't much to look at. Rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that sometimes smoked more than it should, and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. But it was home. And more importantly, it was safe. The woman's weight felt substantial in his arms, not just physically, but emotionally. It had been 3 years since he'd held another human being this close. 3 years since the fire that took everything from him. His wife, Sarah, had been carrying their first child when the flames consumed their house on that terrible October night. Jake had been in town, settling accounts with the feed store, when he saw the orange glow against the horizon. By the time he'd ridden home, there was nothing left but ash and sorrow. He'd sold that land afterward, unable to bear the memories, and bought this smaller spread 15 miles outside Cedar Falls. It was rougher country here, where the Colorado plains began their gradual climb toward the Rocky Mountains. The soil was harder to work, the winters more bitter, but the isolation suited his wounded soul. Most days, he saw no one but his horse, his handful of cattle, and the occasional traveling merchant. Setting the woman gently on his bed, the only real piece of furniture he owned, Jake lit the oil lamp and got his first clear look at her condition. She was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 25, with auburn hair matted with blood and dirt. Her dress, though torn and stained, had once been fine quality. The fabric felt like nothing he could afford, and the cut spoke of city tailoring. A torn train ticket protruded from her dress pocket, and Jake carefully extracted it. The paper was bloodied but readable. Catherine Whitmore, and a destination that made him frown. Denver, not the eastbound direction where he'd found her. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and Jake could see the gentle rise and fall of her advanced pregnancy beneath the damaged fabric. 6 months along, maybe 7, he estimated. He'd helped deliver enough calves to recognize the signs of impending birth, though human mothers were territory he'd never navigated alone. With gentle efficiency born of necessity, Jake began the work of cleaning her wounds. The worst injury was a gash along her hairline that had bled considerably but wasn't deep enough to be fatal. Her hands were scraped raw, defensive wounds that suggested she'd fought her attackers. Bruises darkened her arms and shoulders, painting a grim picture of violence that made Jake's jaw clench with suppressed anger. As he worked, memories of Sarah flooded back unbidden. His wife's laugh, bright as spring water, the way she'd hum while kneading bread, flour dusting her dark hair, the excitement in her eyes when she'd told him about the baby. Sarah had been everything good in his world, and when she died, Jake thought he'd buried his capacity for caring along with her. Yet here he was, tending to a stranger with the same careful attention he'd once shown his wife. The realization unsettled him. Jake Morrison had become comfortable with his solitude, with the predictable rhythm of chores and the blessed numbness that hard work provided. This woman's presence threatened that carefully constructed peace. As dawn gave way to full morning, Jake rode into Cedar Falls to fetch Doc Henley. The town sat in a natural depression between two hills, its main street a dusty ribbon lined with the usual frontier establishments: general store, saloon, church, blacksmith, and a handful of other businesses that served the scattered ranching community. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, which made Jake's mission delicate. Doc Henley was past 60, with wild white hair and spectacles that perpetually slipped down his nose. He'd been the only medical man within 50 miles for the better part of 2 decades, treating everything from bullet wounds to difficult births with equal competence and discretion. If anyone could help the woman without asking too many questions, it was Doc. Found her by the tracks, Jake explained simply, as they rode back toward his ranch. Hurt bad, but alive. She's carrying. Doc nodded, his practiced eye taking in Jake's. Tension. How far along? 6 months, maybe more. Any idea who she is? Jake hesitated. Found a train ticket. Name of Catherine Whitmore. Doc's eyebrows rose slightly. Whitmore was a name that carried weight in Colorado territory. Railroad. Money, political connections. The kind of family that made headlines in the Denver papers. But he was too professional to press for details that Jake wasn't offering. Back at the cabin, Doc conducted a thorough examination while Jake waited outside, pacing the small porch like an expectant father. The irony wasn't lost on him. When Doc finally emerged, his expression was cautiously optimistic. "She'll live," he pronounced, cleaning his hands in the wash basin Jake provided. Concussion, various cuts and bruises, but nothing that won't heal. The baby seems fine, though I'd prefer to monitor her closely for the next few days. Any idea what happened to her? Train accident, maybe, Jake offered, though the lie sat uncomfortably on his tongue. Doc studied him for a long moment. Jake, I've been doctoring folks longer than you've been breathing. Those aren't accident injuries. Someone worked her over deliberate-like. Question is, are you prepared for whatever trouble might follow her here? Jake's hand moved instinctively to the Colt, 45 on his hip, the weight familiar and reassuring. I reckon I can handle trouble, Doc. I'm sure you can, but can you handle caring for someone again? The question hit Jake like a physical blow. Doc Henley had been the one to tend Sarah's body after the fire, had seen Jake's grief raw and overwhelming. The older man's concern was genuine, born of professional observation and personal friendship. She needs help, Jake said simply. I've got help to give. Over the next 2 days, Jake settled into a routine of nursing that felt both foreign and familiar. He'd never tended a pregnant woman, but his natural gentleness and careful attention served him well. He prepared simple broths, changed bandages, and monitored her fever as it gradually broke. Martha Connolly from the general store proved invaluable, arriving with clean women's clothing and practical advice. Martha was one of those frontier women who'd raised 6 children while helping to build a town, from nothing but determination and hard work. Her husband had died in a mining accident 5 years prior, leaving her to run the store and care for her youngest 2 children alone. She's lucky you found her, Martha observed, folding clean petticoats with practiced efficiency. Not many men would take on this kind of responsibility. Jake didn't respond, but something in his expression must have conveyed his thoughts, because Martha's weathered face softened with understanding. Sarah would have wanted you to help her, she said quietly. Your wife had the kindest heart of anyone I ever knew. She wouldn't want you to turn away from someone in need just because caring hurts. On the 3rd morning, Catherine Whitmore opened her eyes. Jake was sitting beside the bed, mending a bridle with slow, methodical stitches when he heard her sharp intake of breath. Her eyes, a startling shade of green that reminded him of deep forest pools, darted around the unfamiliar room before settling on his face. Where am I? Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "My cabin," Jake replied, setting aside his leatherwork. "You're safe. Name's Jake Morrison." She struggled to sit up, wincing at the movement. Jake reached out instinctively to steady her, and she flinched away from his touch. The reaction told him volumes about what she'd endured. "Easy," he said softly, the same tone he'd use with a frightened horse. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." Catherine's hand moved protectively to her swollen belly, and relief flooded her features when she felt the baby's movement. "How long have I been?" 3 days. Doc says you and the baby are going to be fine." "The baby—" She closed her eyes, and Jake saw tears gathering at the corners. When she opened them again, the vulnerability was gone, replaced by a wariness that spoke of hard-won survival instincts. "Who are you?" she asked, studying his face as if memorizing it for future reference. "Just a man who found you by the railroad tracks," Jake replied. "Figured you needed help." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Jake could almost see her mind working, weighing options and calculating risks. Finally, she nodded slightly. "Thank you," she said, and something in those simple words carried the weight of genuine gratitude mixed with deep exhaustion. As the days passed and Catherine's strength returned, Jake found himself drawn into conversations that revealed glimpses of a complex, intelligent woman. She spoke carefully, revealing little about her past, but demonstrating an education and refinement that confirmed his suspicions about her background. Yet, she also showed a practical resilience that impressed him, adapting to the cabin's primitive conditions without complaint. The torn train ticket remained a mystery between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that Catherine Whitmore was running from something or someone. Jake didn't press for details, respecting her privacy while quietly reinforcing the security of his modest home. Extra ammunition appeared in strategic locations, and he found himself checking the horizon more frequently during his daily chores. In quiet moments, usually in the evening when the lamp cast warm shadows around the cabin, Jake caught himself watching Catherine as she mended her torn dress or helped prepare simple meals despite her condition. There was something about her presence that filled spaces in his life he hadn't realized were empty. The cabin felt less like a retreat from the world and more like a home. But homes, Jake knew from bitter experience, could be lost in a single night. And whatever had put Catherine Whitmore beside those railroad tracks was still out there, waiting in the darkness beyond his lamp's reach. The silver locket had been hidden beneath Catherine's chemise, pressed close to her heart where Jake's careful nursing hadn't discovered it. She fingered it now as she sat by the cabin's single window, watching Jake work with his horses in the corral. The initials CW were engraved in elegant script on its surface, and inside rested a photograph of her father, distinguished, commanding, and completely unaware that his own daughter now saw him as the architect of her near destruction. It had been a week since she'd awakened in Jake Morrison's cabin, and fragments of memory had been returning like pieces of a shattered mirror, each one sharp enough to cut. The train, the struggle, the hands that had gripped her arms and thrown her from the moving car as if she were nothing more than unwanted baggage. But worst of all, the knowledge of who had ordered it done. "You're looking stronger today," Jake observed as he entered the cabin, wiping his hands on a rag. His presence had become a source of comfort she hadn't expected, this quiet man who asked no questions and demanded nothing in return for his kindness. Catherine turned from the window, decision crystallizing in her mind. "Jake, I need to tell you something. About who I am, about why I was on that train." Jake settled into the room's only chair, his weathered face patient and attentive. "Only if you want to. My name is Catherine Whitmore. My father owns the Colorado Mountain Railroad." She watched his expression carefully, but Jake's face revealed only mild surprise at the confirmation of what he'd likely already suspected. "I was running away," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "from a marriage my father arranged to a man named Vincent Harrow." Jake's eyes sharpened at the name. Vincent Harrow was known throughout the territory. A businessman, whose wealth came from contracts that always seemed to favor him, whose competitors had a tendency to face unfortunate accidents or sudden legal troubles. The kind of man who smiled while he slid a knife between your ribs. Harrow owns most of the freight contracts along the Front Range, Catherine explained. What people don't know is how he maintains that monopoly. I discovered ledgers in my father's study, records of bribes to territorial officials, forged, documents transferring land from homesteaders to Harrow's companies, even payments to men who removed obstacles. She paused, her hand moving protectively to her swollen belly. Vincent wanted to marry me, to cement his partnership with my father. When I refused, Catherine's voice broke slightly. He didn't take rejection well. His men cornered me in our Denver mansion's garden one evening. They said it would be easier if I just accepted my fate. Jake's hands clenched into fists, but his voice remained calm. The baby is the result of that evening. Catherine's chin lifted defiantly. But Vincent made a mistake. He left me alive, and I made copies of everything, every bribe, every forged deed, every payment for violence. I hid the documents and took the originals with me when I fled. She reached into the bodice of her dress and withdrew an oiled leather portfolio, slim but substantial. This could destroy both Vincent and my father, send them to prison for decades, but it also makes me the most dangerous woman in Colorado territory. Jake studied the portfolio as if it were a rattlesnake. And they know you have it? Vincent discovered the theft just before I reached the train station. I barely made it aboard, but I thought I was safe once we left Denver. Catherine's laugh was bitter. I should have known my father would choose his business empire over his own daughter. The full implications hit Jake like a physical blow. Your father ordered this? Who else could have gotten word to men waiting along the route? Who else would have known exactly which train I was on? Catherine's eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. I kept hoping, even as they dragged me to the car door, that somehow it was just Vincent acting alone. But the conductor, a man who'd worked for my father for 15 years, he looked right at me as they threw me off. He knew. Jake rose and moved to the window, scanning the horizon with new urgency. The isolation of his ranch, which had once felt like protection, now seemed dangerously exposed. How many men would they send? Vincent employs at least a dozen professional gunmen, men who fought in the war and never found peacetime work that suited their particular skills. Catherine joined him at the window. They'll be looking for my body first, but when they don't find it, they'll expand their search. Jake finished grimly. He turned to face her, seeing not the refined lady who'd awakened in his bed, but a woman who'd survived attempted murder and still had the courage to fight back. What were you planning to do with those documents? There's a federal marshal in California, Samuel Porter. He's been investigating territorial corruption for months, but hasn't been able to get evidence. These papers would give him everything he needs. Catherine's voice hardened with resolve. I won't let Vincent and my father destroy any more lives. There are families on those forged deeds, homesteaders who lost everything because of their... Agreed. Jake nodded slowly, understanding the magnitude of what she was asking without her having to say it directly. California's a long way from here, especially for a woman in your condition. I know. Catherine met his eyes steadily. I'm not asking you to come with me, Jake. You've already done more than anyone could expect. But I need supplies, maybe. A horse if you can spare one. I'll find a way to repay you once. Stop. Jake's voice was quiet but firm. You think I'd send a pregnant woman off alone to face killers? What kind of man do you take me for? Catherine's composure finally cracked, tears spilling over despite her efforts to maintain control. I take you for a good man who's already lost enough. I won't be responsible for bringing violence to your door. Jake reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently cupped her face with his calloused hands. Catherine, I lost my family to fire and fate, things I couldn't control or fight. But this is different. This is a choice, and I'm choosing to help you. Why? She whispered. Jake was quiet for a long moment, searching for words to explain something he barely understood himself. Because 3 years ago, I thought I was done living, just going through the motions, waiting for time to pass. Then I found you by those tracks, and for the first time since Sarah died, I felt like I had a purpose again. Catherine leaned into his touch, the warmth of human connection she'd thought lost forever. They'll kill you if they find us together. Then we'll have to make sure they don't find us. Jake's voice carried a quiet confidence that spoke of experience with violence. I wasn't always a rancher, Catherine. I know how to fight, and I know this country better than any hired guns from Denver. That evening, as they planned their escape, 2 riders appeared on the distant ridge overlooking Jake's property. They sat their horses for several long minutes, silhouettes against the sunset, before disappearing back the way they'd come. Catherine saw them from the window and felt ice form in her stomach. They're here. Jake checked his rifle and moved to extinguish the lamp. Time to go. As darkness fell over the Colorado territory, Jake Morrison prepared to leave the only home he'd known for 3 years. The cabin that had sheltered his grief would now become part of his past, abandoned in favor of an uncertain future with a woman whose courage had rekindled something in his soul he'd thought permanently extinguished. In the distance, more riders appeared, dark shapes moving with predatory purpose across the landscape. The hunt for Catherine Whitmore had begun in earnest, and with it, a test of whether love newly born could survive the fires of violence and betrayal that were racing toward them through the night. The leather document case felt heavier than its actual weight as Catherine secured it inside her traveling dress. The papers that could topple an empire now pressed against her ribs like a physical reminder of the stakes they faced. Jake moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, gathering supplies and ammunition with the methodical calm of a man who'd prepared for battle before. "We'll head north first," Jake explained, rolling his few possessions into a compact bedroll. "Make them think we're going toward Wyoming, then we'll double back through the high country and head west." Catherine watched him work, marveling at how quickly the quiet rancher had transformed into something harder, more dangerous. There was an economy to his movements that spoke of military training, a way of checking his weapons that suggested familiarity with violence beyond frontier self-defense. "You were a soldier," she observed. Jake paused in his packing. "Union cavalry for a time, scouted for General Sheridan in the Shenandoah." He resumed his work without elaboration, but Catherine filed the information away. Whatever Jake Morrison had been before becoming a rancher, it might be the difference between life and death in the days to come. They left the cabin in the pre-dawn darkness, Catherine riding Jake's gentle mare while he led his gelding on foot until they were well clear of the property. The document case's straps cut into Catherine's shoulders, but she bore the discomfort without complaint. Each step took them farther from the safety Jake had provided and closer to an uncertain future that depended entirely on their ability to outrun, outfight, or outwit Vincent Harrow's professional killers. The first stop was Cedar Falls, where Jake needed to gather intelligence and supplies without arousing suspicion. Catherine waited in a grove of cottonwoods outside town, while Jake rode in alone, every minute of his absence stretching her nerves tighter. Doc Henley was sweeping his front porch when Jake approached, the older man's keen eyes immediately noting the tension in the younger man's posture. "Morning, Jake. How's your patient?" "Better," Jake replied carefully. "Doc, you been hearing anything about strangers in town? Men asking questions?" Doc's broom stilled. "Matter of fact, yes. 2 fellows came by yesterday evening claiming to be railroad detectives looking for a woman who'd stolen company property. Had badges and everything, but something about them didn't sit right." Jake's blood chilled. Vincent's men were already working their way through the local population, probably offering rewards for information. "What did you tell them? That I hadn't seen any strange women lately?" Which was true enough at the time. Doc's weathered face creased with concern. "Jake, whatever trouble you've stepped into, it's the kind that gets folks killed. You sure you know what you're doing?" "I'm sure I know what I have to do," Jake replied. "Thanks for the warning, Doc." At Martha Connolly's general store, Jake found a similar story. The supposed railroad detectives had been thorough, asking about any woman who might have been injured or seeking medical attention. Martha had also been evasive, her maternal instincts recognizing something predatory about the men despite their official credentials. They offered $50 for information, Martha confided, as she helped Jake gather trail supplies. $50 for news of one woman. That's more than most folks see in 6 months. Jake nodded grimly. Vincent Harrow understood frontier economics. $50 would be enough to make most people forget any reservations about cooperating with strangers. Did they say where they'd be staying? The silver dollar, at least for tonight. But Jake, Martha gripped his arm with surprising strength. Whatever that poor girl's running from, it's big enough to bring professional manhunters to our quiet little town. Don't let stubbornness get you both killed. Jake covered her hand with his own. Martha, if anyone comes asking about me, you haven't seen me since last week. And whatever you do, don't let on that you know anything about a pregnant woman. I understand. Martha's eyes were bright with unshed tears. You take care of yourself, Jake Morrison, and you take care of her too. When Jake returned to the Cottonwood Grove, he found Catherine teaching herself to load his spare revolver with the methodical concentration of a woman who understood that her survival might depend on such skills. The sight of her, refined hands working with deadly metal while her pregnancy curved her body into the protective posture of expectant motherhood, struck him as both heartbreaking and inspiring. They're already here, he reported, dismounting and checking the distant horizon. 2 men at least, calling themselves railroad detectives and offering rewards for information. Catherine's face paled, but her voice remained steady. How long before they realize you've helped me? Not long. Doc and Martha will keep quiet, but someone will remember seeing me buy supplies for 2 people instead of 1. Jake studied the sky, calculating travel time and distances. We need to be deep in the high country before they start connecting pieces. As they rode north from Cedar Falls, Catherine found herself studying Jake's profile in the morning light. The quiet rancher who'd nursed her back to health was still there, but underneath lay someone harder, a man who'd seen war and learned its lessons well. The realization should have frightened her, but instead it brought a strange comfort. Vincent. Harrow's men were professional killers, but they were hunting a woman protected by someone who understood violence from the soldier's perspective. Tell me about the high country, Catherine said as they climbed into the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. It's rough going, especially for someone in your condition, Jake replied honestly. Cold nights, thin air, and terrain that'll break a horse's leg if you're not careful. But it's also country where a man who knows the trails can disappear for weeks at a time. And you know the trails. Jake's smile was grim. I spent 2 summers up there after Sarah died, trapping and hunting, trying to outrun grief in places where there wasn't another human soul for 50 miles in any direction. They climbed steadily through the morning, the familiar landscape of Jake's ranch giving way to wilder country where pine trees grew thick, and the air carried the sharp scent of snow even in late spring. Catherine's pregnancy made the riding difficult, but she endured without complaint, understanding that every mile between them and their pursuers increased their chances of survival. At midday, they paused beside a mountain stream to rest the horses and share a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. Catherine removed her shoes and soaked her swollen feet in the icy water, sighing with relief. How are you holding up? Jake asked, genuine concern in his voice. Better than I expected, Catherine admitted. A month ago, I'd never been on a horse for more than an hour at a time. Now I'm fleeing across the wilderness, carrying evidence that could start a war. She laughed shakily. Strange how quickly life can change. Jake nodded, understanding the sentiment better than most. Catherine, what you're carrying, those documents, they're worth killing for. But they're also worth dying for, aren't they? Catherine's hand moved to the document case pressed against her ribs. There's a family in Golden, the Hendersons. Harrow wanted their land for a rail spur, so he forged papers claiming they'd defaulted on taxes that were already paid. When they refused to leave, his men burned their crops and shot their livestock. The husband tried to fight back legally, but mysterious witnesses appeared claiming the family owed gambling debts. Her voice hardened. 3 children went hungry that winter because of Vincent Harrow's greed. And your father knew. Not only knew, he provided the railroad lawyers, who made it all look legal. Catherine's eyes blazed with anger that burned away any remaining doubt about her resolve. That's just one family, Jake. There are dozens of others in those papers. Miners cheated out of claims, shopkeepers bankrupted by impossible contracts, even a preacher whose church was seized on fabricated charges because it sat on land Harrow wanted. Jake studied her face, seeing not the sheltered daughter of privilege he'd first imagined, but a woman whose conscience wouldn't let her turn away from injustice, even when fighting it meant risking everything. Then we get those papers to California, he said simply. Whatever it takes. As they prepared to resume their journey, the sound of distant horses drifted up from the valley below. Jake counted at least 4 riders moving fast along the trail they'd taken from Cedar Falls. Vincent Harrow's. Men had found their trail. The hand-carved wooden cross felt smooth beneath Catherine's fingers as she traced its simple lines, the wood still bearing the faint scent of pine from the tree where Jake had cut it. He'd presented it to her that morning as they broke camp. In a hidden meadow, high in the Rockies, his weathered hands almost shy as he offered the gift. "It's not much," Jake had said, his eyes focused on the distant peaks rather than her face. "But I figured everyone deserves something beautiful, especially when times are hard." Catherine had accepted the cross with tears threatening, understanding that this simple carving represented more than religious faith. It was Jake's way of saying he believed in their future together, that he was carving hope into reality, one careful stroke at a time. Now, 3 days later, she wore it on a leather cord around her neck, the weight of it a constant reminder that she was no longer facing her trials alone. Their pursuers had proven persistent but predictable. Jake's military experience served them well as he led Catherine through terrain that favored defenders over attackers. They'd switched directions twice, using rocky ground and stream beds to mask their trail, always climbing higher into country where the air grew thin and the nights cold enough to frost. Catherine's pregnancy had become both burden and motivator. The baby's movements grew stronger each day, tiny feet and fists pressing against her ribs as if the child sensed the urgency of their flight. The physical demands of mountain travel were exhausting, but Catherine found reserves of strength she'd never known she possessed. Each morning brought new aches, but also new determination to reach safety before her child entered a world of violence and pursuit. "How much farther to California?" Catherine asked, as they paused to water the horses at a crystal-clear mountain lake. Jake studied the western horizon, calculating distances against time and the reality of her advancing pregnancy. 3 weeks of hard travel through easy country. 6 weeks or more through mountains like these. He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Catherine, you're strong, but you're also 7 months along now. We need to think about finding a place where you can have the baby safely." The admission of physical limitations stung Catherine's pride, but she couldn't deny the truth of his words. The baby had grown noticeably even in the few weeks since leaving Jake's cabin, and she could feel changes in her body that spoke of approaching birth. "There are settlements in the valleys," Jake continued gently. "Good people who'd help. A woman in need. We could stop, let you rest until after—" "No," Catherine's voice was firm. "Vincent's men won't stop looking just because I'm in labor. And once the baby comes, traveling will be even harder." She met his eyes with quiet determination. "We keep going, Jake. We finish this." Jake nodded, understanding her resolve even as he worried about the physical cost. "Then we'll need to be smarter about how we travel. Rest more during the day, move at night when we can, and we'll need to reach friendlier territory before you get much farther along." That evening, as they sheltered in a cave that Jake remembered from his trapping days, Catherine finally broached the subject that had been growing between them like a flower in unexpected soil. "Jake," she said softly, watching him tend their small, smokeless fire. "When this is over, when we reach California and I've given Marshal Porter the evidence, what happens then?" Jake's hands stilled on the piece of wood he'd been feeding. To the flames. It was a question he'd been avoiding, partly because the answer seemed too good to be true, and partly because their survival was still far from certain. "I reckon that depends on what you want to happen," he said carefully. Catherine moved closer to him, close enough that he could see the firelight dancing in her green eyes. "I want to know if you're planning to leave me in California and ride back to Colorado. I want to know if what's growing between us is just circumstances." Jake set down the firewood and turned to face her fully. "Catherine, you're educated, refined. You're the daughter of one of the richest men in the territory. When this is over, you could have any life you wanted. That's not what I asked." Catherine's voice carried a note of frustration. "I asked what you wanted." Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the flickering light. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he'd kept carefully controlled. "I want to wake up beside you every morning for the rest of my life. I want to help raise that baby as if it were my own blood. I want to build something good and lasting with you, whether that's in California or Colorado or anywhere else you'd have me." He paused, vulnerability making his voice crack slightly. "But wanting something and deserving it aren't the same thing." Catherine reached out and took his calloused hands in hers. "Jake Morrison, do you think I care about money, about social position? A month ago, I was engaged to one of the richest men in the territory, and he was a monster who thought he owned me like property." Her grip tightened. "You found me broken and dying, and you brought me back to life without asking for anything. In return, you've risked everything to help me seek justice for people you've never met. If that doesn't make you worthy of love, then nothing in this world does." Jake leaned forward and kissed her then, gentle and careful, as if she were made of precious glass. Catherine kissed him back with a passion that spoke of choices made and futures claimed, her hands tangling in his hair as months of fear and uncertainty gave way to the simple truth of two people who'd found each other in the wilderness. When they separated, both were breathing hard, the cave suddenly feeling charged with possibilities. "When we reach California," Catherine whispered against his lips, "I want us to be married properly. I want your name and your ring, and I want everyone to know that you're mine." Jake's smile was brighter than the firelight. "Yes, ma'am, I'd like that very much." Their kiss was interrupted by the distant sound of horses moving through the night, multiple riders, traveling without regard for stealth. Jake was on his feet instantly, moving to the cave mouth to peer down the mountainside, far below perhaps. 2 miles distant, he could see torches moving along the trail they'd abandoned that afternoon. Vincent's men had brought reinforcements, and they were no longer trying to hide their pursuit. "How many?" Catherine asked, joining him at the cave. "Entrance," Jake counted the moving lights grimly. 8, maybe 10, and they're not bothering with stealth anymore. Catherine's hand found the wooden cross at her throat, drawing strength from its simple presence. "Then they think they have us trapped. Maybe they do." Jake checked his rifle and moved to saddle the horses. But trapped animals fight hardest when they've got nothing left to lose. As they prepared to flee deeper into the mountains, Catherine felt the baby kick strongly, as if the child were adding its own determination to their desperate flight toward freedom. Behind them, the torches continued their relentless climb, bringing violence and retribution ever closer to the small family that was fighting to be born in the Colorado wilderness. The antique compass had belonged to Catherine's grandfather, a sea captain who'd navigated treacherous waters from Boston to San Francisco during the gold rush years. She pressed it into Jake's palm as they prepared to descend into the valley below, its brass surface warm from her touch and polished smooth by generations of use. "This guided my grandfather through storms that would have killed lesser men," Catherine said softly, her fingers lingering on Jake's as he accepted the precious instrument. "Now I'm trusting it to guide us through our own storm." Jake studied the compass face, noting the inscription on its back. "To Catherine Elizabeth Whitmore, May you always find your true north. Captain James Whitmore, 1847. The weight of her trust settled over him like a mantle of responsibility and honor. We'll make it through, Jake promised, securing the compass in his vest pocket where he could feel its steady presence against his heart. Your grandfather's compass will see us to safety. They'd been traveling for 2 weeks now, their route a zigzag pattern through some of Colorado's most unforgiving terrain. Jake's knowledge of the high country had kept them ahead of Vincent's hunting party, but barely. The pursuers had grown to nearly a dozen men, professional trackers, who compensated for their unfamiliarity with the specific terrain through sheer persistence and superior numbers. Catherine's pregnancy had become increasingly apparent, her movements more careful, her need for rest more frequent. Yet she'd adapted to the harsh conditions with a resilience that continued to amaze Jake. The refined lady who'd awakened in his cabin had transformed into someone harder, more practical, a woman who could break camp in darkness, handle a rifle with growing competence, and endure physical hardships that would have broken many frontier-born women. Their descent into the valley revealed scattered homesteads and the smoke trails of a small settlement nestled against the western slope of the mountains. Jake studied the community through his field glasses, noting the orderly layout of buildings and the well-tended fields that spoke of established prosperity. Millerville, Jake identified, lowering the glasses. Founded by miners who struck silver about 5 years back. Good people mostly, but they don't take kindly to strangers bringing trouble. Catherine adjusted her position on the mare, one hand supporting her lower back, where the constant riding had created a persistent ache. Do we have a choice? The horses need rest, and so do we. Jake nodded reluctantly. They'd been pushing hard for 3 days, trying to stay ahead of their pursuers after a too-close encounter near Copper Creek. The horses were showing signs of exhaustion, and Catherine's face had taken on the pallor that spoke of someone nearing. Her physical limits. We'll pose as married travelers heading to California, Jake decided. You're my pregnant wife, and we're seeking supplies and a safe place to rest before continuing our journey. Catherine smiled at the fiction that felt more like prophecy. That's not entirely a lie, is it? No, ma'am. I reckon it's more like a preview of coming attractions. They rode into Millerville as afternoon shadows grew long, presenting themselves as Jake and Catherine Morrison to the curious locals who gathered to observe the newcomers. The town was larger than it had appeared from the mountainside. Perhaps 200 souls, with a main street that boasted a hotel, general store, church, and several other businesses that indicated genuine prosperity rather than the boom and bust. Desperation of typical mining camps. The hotel proprietor, a matronly woman named Mrs. Kellerman, took one look at Catherine's condition and immediately insisted on providing their best room, along with access to hot baths and a proper meal. Her maternal instincts were clearly triggered by the sight of a pregnant woman who'd obviously been traveling hard. You poor dear, Mrs. Kellerman fussed as she led Catherine upstairs. Traveling in your condition through this rough country. What were you thinking? Your husband should have better sense. Jake accepted the gentle scolding with good grace, understanding that their cover story required him to play the role of a somewhat irresponsible husband who'd subjected his pregnant wife to unnecessary hardship. Their room was modest but clean, with a real bed that felt like luxury after weeks of sleeping on hard ground. Catherine sank into the mattress with a sigh of pure relief, her hands automatically moving to massage her swollen feet. Jake, she said softly, as he secured their belongings and checked the room's defensive positions out of habit. I need to tell you something about the baby. The seriousness in her tone made Jake turn to give her his full attention. Catherine's expression was a mixture of anticipation and concern that made his stomach tighten with worry. The baby's been moving differently the past few days, Catherine continued. Lower, more pressure. Mrs. Kellerman knows midwifery. I could see it in how she looked at me. She thinks I'm closer to my time than we'd hoped. Jake sat heavily in the room's single chair, running his hands through his hair as he processed this development. How close? Maybe a month. Maybe less. Catherine's voice was steady, but Jake could see the fear she was trying to hide. Jake, if the baby comes while we're still being hunted, it won't come to that, Jake said firmly, though he was already calculating travel times and distances with this new urgency factoring into his plans. We'll reach California in time. We'll find Marshal Porter, deliver the evidence, and then we'll find a proper doctor for the birth. Catherine nodded, wanting to believe but understanding the realities of frontier travel better now than she had a month ago. And if we don't, if Vincent's men catch up to us before we reach safety. Jake moved to sit beside her on the bed, taking her hands in his larger, calloused ones. Then we'll face whatever comes together. You, me, and the baby. As a family. That evening, they shared dinner in the hotel's common room, carefully observing the other guests and listening to local conversation for any signs that word of their pursuit had reached Millerville. The talk was mostly of mining claims and weather, the everyday concerns of people whose lives hadn't been touched by the corruption and violence that defined Vincent Harrow's world. Catherine played her role perfectly, the loving wife grateful for her husband's care during a difficult journey. Jake found himself marveling at her performance, then realized it wasn't entirely performance. The affection she showed him, the way she leaned into his support, felt genuine in ways that made his heart race with possibilities. After dinner, they walked carefully around the town's perimeter, Jake's trained eye noting defensive positions and escape routes, while Catherine simply enjoyed the luxury of walking on level ground without the constant motion of horseback travel. It's peaceful here, Catherine observed, watching children play. In a yard where a young mother hung laundry in the evening light. The kind of place where you could raise a family without worrying about violence or corruption. California's got places like this too, Jake replied. Peaceful valleys where a man can build something lasting. Catherine stopped walking and turned to face him, her hands resting on her swollen belly where their future child grew stronger each day. Promise me something, Jake. When this is over, when we've delivered the evidence and seen justice done, promise me we'll find a place like this. A place where our children can grow up safe. Jake pulled her close, careful of her pregnancy, and kissed her forehead with a tenderness that spoke of promises deeper than words. I promise, Catherine, we'll build something good together. Something that lasts. As they returned to the hotel, neither noticed the lone rider who'd positioned himself on the ridge overlooking Millerville, watching the town through field glasses as darkness fell. Vincent Harrow's hunters had found their trail once again, and by morning the peaceful valley would become another battlefield in their desperate flight toward freedom. The faded wedding ring had lived in Jake's pocket for 3 years, wrapped in a piece of soft leather to protect the delicate gold band that had once circled his wife Sarah's finger. As dawn broke over Millerville and Catherine still slept peacefully beside him, Jake unwrapped the ring for the first time since her funeral, studying its simple beauty in the early morning light. Sarah had worn this ring for only 2 years before. The fire took her, but those had been the happiest years of Jake's life. Now, watching Catherine's face in sleep, peaceful despite the danger that surrounded them, Jake realized that happiness could come twice to a man lucky enough to recognize it. The ring would need to be resized. Catherine's fingers were more slender than Sarah's had been, but Jake could envision it on her hand, a symbol of promises made and futures claimed even in the midst of their desperate flight. He rewrapped the ring carefully and returned it to his pocket, the decision made even as Catherine stirred beside him. "Good morning," Catherine murmured, her hand automatically moving to the curve of her belly where the baby had been particularly active during the night. "Did you sleep?" "Some," Jake replied, though he'd actually spent most of the night watching the windows and listening for sounds that didn't belong. His military instincts remained sharp after years of civilian life, and they were screaming warnings that their sanctuary was about to be shattered. Mrs. Kellerman provided them with a substantial breakfast, clucking over Catherine's condition, with the efficiency of a woman who'd helped deliver half the babies in Millerville. Over eggs and fresh bread, she shared her assessment with the bluntness of frontier practicality. "You're carrying low and forward, dear," she observed, refilling Catherine's coffee cup. "First babies usually take their time, but this little one, it seems eager to meet the world. I'd guess 3 weeks, maybe less." Catherine exchanged a worried glance with Jake. 3 weeks would barely get them to the California border, assuming they could travel without further delays from their pursuers. "Is there a doctor in town?" Jake asked. "Doc Brennan handles most of our medical needs, though he's better with broken bones and bullet wounds than birthing babies. For that, we usually rely on experience and prayer." Mrs. Kellerman's expression grew concerned. "You're not planning to continue traveling immediately, are you? A woman in her condition should be resting, not bouncing around on horseback through mountain passes." Before Jake could respond, the hotel's front door burst open, and young Tommy Kellerman, Mrs. Kellerman's 12-year-old son, ran into the dining room with the urgency of childhood drama. "Ma, there's riders coming into town, lots of them. And they got guns and badges, and they're asking about strangers." Jake was on his feet before the boy finished speaking, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon. Through the dining room window he could see a dust cloud on the eastern approach to town, too large to be anything but a significant group of mounted men. "The back exit," Jake said quietly to Catherine, helping her rise from her chair. "Now!" Mrs. Kellerman's eyes darted between them, maternal instincts warring with growing suspicion. "What kind of trouble are you folks running from?" "The kind that gets innocent people hurt," Catherine replied honestly. "Mrs. Kellerman, if they ask about us, you haven't seen anyone matching our description. For your family's sake." The older woman studied Catherine's face and apparently found something there that convinced her. "Tommy, go tell your father to ready the wagon. Quickly now." Jake gathered their belongings while Catherine moved as quickly as her pregnancy allowed, toward the hotel's rear entrance. Through the front windows, they could see riders entering the main street, at least 8 men, well armed and moving with the purposeful coordination of a professional hunting party. Mr. Kellerman met them at the back of the hotel with a farm wagon loaded with hay, his weathered face grim with understanding. "Hide under the hay until we're clear of town," he instructed. "I'll drive you to the Andersons' place. They're good people, and their homestead's got better defensive positions than anywhere in the valley." Catherine climbed into the wagon with Jake's assistance, the physical effort causing her to gasp slightly as the baby shifted position. Jake arranged the hay to conceal them both, creating a small pocket of air and visibility while providing cover from casual observation. The wagon lurched into motion just as the first of Vincent's men reached the hotel. Through gaps in the hay, Jake could see the leader, a hard-faced man with the bearing of an ex-soldier, questioning Mrs. Kellerman on the front porch. Her responses were animated and convincing, the performance of a woman who'd raised 6 children and knew how to manage difficult men. The 15-minute wagon ride to the Anderson homestead passed in tense silence, broken only by Catherine's carefully controlled breathing as contractions, mild but unmistakable, began to signal that the baby's arrival was imminent rather than weeks away. "Jake," Catherine whispered as the wagon hit a particularly rough patch of road, "I think the stress is bringing on labor." Jake's blood ran cold. A woman giving birth was vulnerable in ways that went beyond the physical, requiring safety and stability that their current situation couldn't provide. Yet Catherine's body was apparently making its own decisions about timing, indifferent to the danger that surrounded them. The Anderson homestead appeared ahead, a modest but well-built farmhouse surrounded by cultivated fields and defensive positioning that Jake's military eye immediately appreciated. The house sat on a slight rise with clear fields of fire in all directions and outbuildings that could provide cover for defensive positions. Frank Anderson emerged from his barn as the wagon approached. A man in his 40s with the solid build of someone who'd carved a life from wilderness through hard work and determination. His wife Mary appeared in the farmhouse doorway, wiping her hands on her apron as she observed the unexpected visitors. "Frank, Mary," Mr. Kellerman called out as he brought the wagon to a stop. "These folks need help, and I'm hoping you'll provide it." Jake helped Catherine from beneath the hay, and Mary Anderson's experienced eye immediately assessed the situation. "Mercy," she breathed. "You're in labor, aren't you, dear?" Catherine nodded, another contraction tightening her features. "It's early, but yes. And there are men hunting us. Dangerous men who won't hesitate to hurt anyone who helps us." "Frank," Anderson's expression hardened. "What kind of men?" "The kind who throw pregnant women from moving trains," Jake replied grimly, helping Catherine toward the house as Mary took charge with the efficiency of a woman who delivered 4 children. "Of her own." "Well then," Frank said, his voice carrying the quiet resolve of a man who'd faced down claim jumpers and cattle rustlers, "I reckon they'll find out what happens when they threaten a woman in childbirth on my land." As Catherine was helped into the Anderson farmhouse, Jake looked back toward Millerville, where dust clouds marked the continued presence of their pursuers. The baby was coming whether they were ready or not, and somewhere in the valley below, Vincent Harrow's killers were methodically searching for the woman whose evidence could destroy their employer's empire. The final confrontation was approaching faster than anyone had anticipated, and it would center around the most vulnerable moment in human experience, the moment when new life enters a world that seemed determined to destroy it before it could draw its first breath. The baby's first cry pierced the afternoon air like a declaration of hope in a world gone mad with violence and betrayal. Catherine held her daughter, for the child was indeed a girl, as she'd somehow known she would be, against her chest, tears of exhaustion and joy mingling on her cheeks as Mary Anderson cleaned the newborn with gentle efficiency. "She's perfect," Mary whispered, wrapping the baby in a soft blanket she'd sewn herself. "Small but perfect, born fighting just like her mother." Jake stood beside the bed, his weathered face transformed by wonder as he looked down at the tiny life they'd brought safely into the world despite everything arrayed against them. When Catherine placed the baby in his arms, something shifted permanently in his chest, a recognition that this child was his in every way that mattered. "Blood be damned. What will you call her?" Mary asked, tidying the birthing room with practiced movements. "Sarah?" Catherine said softly, meeting Jake's eyes over the baby's downy head. "After your mother, if that's all right with you." Jake's throat tightened with emotion too deep for words. To hear his mother's name spoken by the woman he loved over the child he would raise as his own, it felt like redemption written in flesh and blood. The peaceful moment shattered when Frank Anderson's voice called urgently from the front porch. "Rider coming in fast. Looks like someone from town." Jake carefully returned baby Sarah to Catherine's arms and moved to the window, his hand automatically checking his weapon. A single horseman was approaching at a gallop, and even at distance, Jake could see the desperation in the rider's posture. The rider proved to be Tommy Kellerman, the boy's face flushed with exertion and fear as he reined his horse to a stop. "In the Andersons' yard, Mr. Morrison," Tommy called out breathlessly. "You got to come quick. They got Ma and Pa, and they're saying terrible things about what they'll do if you don't come back to town." Jake's blood turned to ice. Vincent's men had taken hostages, using innocent people as leverage to force Catherine into the open. It was a tactical move he should have anticipated. Professional killers wouldn't hesitate to threaten civilians to achieve their objectives. "How many men, son?" Frank Anderson asked, his own expression grim with understanding. 8 of them, maybe more. They got badges, but they don't act like lawmen. The leader, he's got a scar down his face and eyes like a snake. He said they'd start shooting folks if the woman don't come to town by sunset. Catherine struggled to sit up despite Mary's protests, her face pale but determined. "I have to go. I won't let innocent people die because of me." Absolutely not, Jake said firmly. You just gave birth an hour ago, and walking into town is exactly what they want you to do. Jake's right, Frank agreed. It's a trap, pure and simple, but that don't mean we can't turn it back on them. Before anyone could respond, the sound of another approaching horse drew their attention. This rider was moving more carefully, and Jake tensed until he recognized the figure dismounting near the barn. That's Doc Henley, Jake said, surprised. What's he doing here? Doc Henley approached the house with the measured steps of a man carrying heavy news. His face was grave, and he clutched a leather satchel that Jake didn't remember seeing before. Jake, Catherine, Doc said as he entered the parlor, nodding to the Andersons. I heard about the baby. Congratulations. But I'm afraid I've brought some disturbing news that changes everything. Doc reached into his satchel and withdrew a letter sealed with red wax, the kind of official correspondence that carried weight in territorial courts. This arrived on the morning stage from Denver, addressed to anyone who might be harboring Catherine Whitmore. It's from her father. Catherine's face went white. My father? But he read it, Doc said grimly, handing her the letter. Read it out loud. Catherine broke the seal with trembling fingers and unfolded the heavy paper. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she began to read, To whom it may concern. I, Richard Whitmore, President of the Colorado Mountain Railroad, do hereby confess my complicity in the criminal activities of Mr. Vincent Harrow and formally withdraw all protection from my daughter, Catherine Elizabeth Whitmore. The enclosed documents detail my participation in illegal land seizures, bribery of territorial officials, and conspiracy to commit fraud. I arranged for my daughter's removal from the Denver-bound train on May 15th, believing that Vincent Harrow's threats against her life were merely business negotiation tactics. I was wrong. Mr. Harrow's men informed me of their true intentions. Only after Catherine had already been thrown from the moving train. My daughter carries evidence that will destroy both Mr. Harrow and myself, but I can no longer protect my business interests at the cost of her life. I hereby surrender myself to federal authorities and pray that this confession will provide some measure of protection for Catherine and her unborn child. May God forgive a father who chose money over his daughter's safety. Silence filled the room as the implications of the letter sank in. Catherine stared at the paper in her hands, trying to process the magnitude of her father's betrayal and his belated attempt at redemption. There's more, Doc said quietly, reaching into his satchel again. Your father included this. He handed Catherine a second letter, this one written in her father's familiar handwriting rather than the formal script of a legal document. Catherine's hands shook as she opened it. My dearest Catherine, she read aloud, I know these words cannot undo the evil I have done, but perhaps they can provide some measure of protection for you and your child. Vincent Harrow is no longer merely angry about your theft of evidence. He is desperate. Federal marshals arrested 12 of his associates yesterday based on preliminary evidence I provided. He knows his empire is crumbling, and he blames you for everything. The men hunting you are not just seeking to recover stolen documents. They have orders to ensure you never testify against him. I have liquidated substantial assets and arranged for a trust fund to be established in California for you and your child. The enclosed deed transfers ownership of the Riverside Ranch near Sacramento to you, free and clear. It is not enough to compensate for my failures as a father, but perhaps it will provide the fresh start you deserve. I do not expect your forgiveness, but I pray for your safety. Your father, who loved you more than he loved himself, though he showed it poorly. Catherine looked up from the letter, tears streaming down her face as she processed her father's complete transformation from enemy to protector. The man who had ordered her thrown from a train was now sacrificing everything to ensure her survival. The deed's legitimate, Doc confirmed. I had it verified before leaving town. You're now the owner of 2,000 acres of prime California. Farmland, complete with a house, barn, and water rights. Jake studied the documents with growing amazement. Richard Whitmore's confession would not only protect Catherine from future persecution, but would likely result in Vincent Harrow's complete destruction. The evidence Catherine carried was no longer their only weapon. It was now supplemented by testimony from the most powerful railroad executive in Colorado Territory. "But Vincent's men don't know about this yet," Frank Anderson observed. "They're still operating under the assumption that Catherine's father wants her captured, which means they're more dangerous than ever," Jake added grimly. "Desperate men, with nothing left to lose." Baby Sarah stirred in Catherine's arms, her tiny fist waving, as if reaching for a future that suddenly seemed far brighter than anyone had dared imagine. Catherine looked down at her daughter, then at Jake, then at the documents that represented her father's attempt to atone for his sins. "Vincent's men are holding innocent people hostage," Catherine said quietly. "Even if my father's confession protects us legally, those people will die if we don't act." Jake nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility that came with power, and they now had power enough to destroy Vincent Harrow completely. But first, they had to survive long enough to use it. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, marking the approach of Vincent's deadline. Time was running out for the hostages in Millerville and for the final confrontation between justice and corruption in the Colorado Territory. The military campaign map spread across Frank Anderson's kitchen table like a battle plan drawn in. Faded ink and hard-won experience. Jake's weathered fingers traced elevation lines and strategic positions with the practiced eye of someone who'd once served under officers whose tactical genius had turned the tide of a civil war. "I didn't just scout for General Sheridan," Jake explained to the assembled group. "Frank and Mary Anderson, Doc Henley and Catherine, who held sleeping baby Sarah while studying the terrain layouts with surprising intensity. I helped plan." Cavalry engagements in mountain country not much different from this. The principles are the same, whether you're fighting Confederate raiders or hired killers. Catherine watched Jake transform before her eyes from the quiet rancher she'd fallen in love with into something harder, more dangerous, a professional soldier whose knowledge of violence might be the only thing standing between their newborn daughter and Vincent Harrow's desperate fury. "The canyon approach here," Jake continued, pointing to a narrow defile marked on his old survey map, "gives us the advantage of elevation and limited access routes. They'll have to come at us single file through terrain that favors defenders over attackers." Frank Anderson nodded approvingly. "I know that country. Fought off claim jumpers there 2 winters back. Good defensive positions, clean water, and only 2 ways in or out." "The question," Doc Henley interjected grimly, "is whether Catherine can travel that far so soon after giving birth. Moving to defensive positions means nothing if the woman we're protecting doesn't survive the journey." Catherine looked down at Sarah's tiny face, peaceful in sleep despite the violence being planned. Around her, the baby had been born, wearing a christening gown sewn from fabric Catherine had salvaged from her wedding dress, the dress she'd been wearing when Vincent's men had brutalized her months ago. Now that same fabric wrapped new life, hope, literally, born from the ashes of trauma. "I can travel," Catherine said firmly. "Mary, how long before I can safely ride?" Mary Anderson studied Catherine with the experienced eye of a woman who'd helped deliver dozens of frontier babies. "Under normal circumstances, I'd say 2 weeks minimum, but these aren't normal circumstances, and you're stronger than most." She paused, maternal concern warring with practical necessity. "If we pad the saddle properly and stop frequently for rest, you might manage it. But Catherine, the risks are less than the risks of staying here when Vincent's men discover our location," Catherine finished. "Mary, I won't put your family in danger by making your home into a battleground." Jake folded the map carefully, his decision made. "We leave at dawn. Frank, I'm grateful for your offer to help, but nothing," Frank interrupted. "Vincent Harrow's corruption has touched every honest rancher in this territory. His forged land claims, his bribed officials, his hired guns terrorizing anyone who stands up to him. This isn't just your fight anymore, Jake. It's ours." Mary nodded firmly. And I won't send a new mother and baby into the wilderness without proper support. Sarah's going to need nursing care, and Catherine will need help that only another woman can provide. Doc Henley adjusted his spectacles and reached for his medical bag. Then it seems I'll be making a house call to some very remote patients. I've been practicing frontier medicine for 20 years. I reckon I can handle one more adventure. Catherine felt tears gathering as she looked around the table at these people who'd chosen to risk everything for a woman and child they'd known for less than a day. It was the kind of courage and selflessness that reminded her why the fight against Vincent Harrow mattered. These were the people his corruption destroyed, the families his greed displaced, the communities his violence terrorized. "There's something else," Catherine said quietly, reaching into the leather portfolio that had never left her side. "My father's confession changes our legal position, but we still have the original evidence of Vincent's crimes. Documents that detail specific victims, dates, amounts, everything needed to ensure he faces justice for every life he's destroyed." She withdrew a thick folder and spread its contents across the table. Property deeds with forged signatures, receipts for bribes, paid to territorial judges, even photographs of mining claims where Vincent's men had murdered claim holders who refused to sell. "There's a family in Golden," Catherine said, pointing to a particular deed. "The Hendersons. Vincent's men burned their crops and killed their livestock because they wouldn't surrender land they'd owned for 5 years. When Thomas Henderson tried to fight the seizure legally, witnesses appeared claiming he owed gambling debts that never existed. Jake studied the document, noting the meticulous detail of corruption laid bare in black and white. "These papers could put Vincent away for life, even without your father's confession." "That's why we can't let them be destroyed," Catherine replied. "Too many families have suffered. Too many honest people have lost everything to Vincent's greed. Justice isn't just about protecting Sarah and me anymore. It's about speaking for everyone who couldn't fight back." As evening approached, they finalized their preparations with the methodical efficiency of people who understood that survival depended on careful planning. Jake cleaned and checked every weapon in the house, his movements economical and precise. Frank Anderson gathered supplies, while Mary prepared medical kits and baby necessities for the journey ahead. Catherine used the time to write letters, detailed instructions for delivering the evidence to Marshal Porter, explanations of Vincent's criminal network, and personal messages to be sent if she didn't survive the coming confrontation. The act of writing felt like preparation for her own funeral, but it also brought a strange peace. Whatever happened, the truth would survive, even if she didn't. "Catherine," Jake said quietly, as she sealed the final letter, "there's something I need to ask you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. Catherine's breath caught as he unwrapped Sarah's wedding ring, the simple gold band catching lamplight like a promise made tangible. "This was my wife's ring," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know the timing isn't ideal, and I know we're facing a fight that might kill us both, but I need you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, I want to face it as your husband." Catherine set down her pen and reached for the ring, her fingers trembling as she examined its simple beauty. "Jake, are you proposing to me while we prepare for what might be our last battle?" "I reckon I am." Jake's smile was rueful but determined. "I've lost one family to circumstances I couldn't control. I won't lose another without at least making our commitment official in the eyes of God and man." Catherine slipped the ring onto her finger, finding that it fit perfectly, despite being sized for another woman's hand. Perhaps, she thought, love had a way of making things fit when they were meant to be. "Yes," she whispered, leaning forward, to kiss him while their daughter slept peacefully between them. "Yes, I'll marry you, Jake Morrison. Tonight, tomorrow, or whenever we can find a preacher brave enough to perform the ceremony." Doc Henley cleared his throat from across the room. "Well, it so happens I'm licensed to perform marriages in this territory. Medical degree came with some unexpected benefits." His eyes twinkled behind his spectacles. "If you folks are serious about this, I'd be honored to officiate." And so, as darkness fell over the Colorado Territory and Vincent Harrow's killers searched the valley below for their quarry, Catherine Elizabeth Whitmore became Catherine Morrison in a simple ceremony performed by lamplight in a frontier kitchen. Frank and Mary Anderson served as witnesses. Baby Sarah slept through her parents' wedding, and love declared itself triumphant even in the shadow of approaching violence. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado," Doc Henley pronounced solemnly, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jake, you may kiss your bride." Jake kissed Catherine with a tenderness that spoke of promises deeper than words, while outside the Anderson farmhouse, night settled over a land that would witness the final confrontation between justice and corruption before another sun could rise. Their wedding night would be spent preparing for war, but Catherine Morrison, no longer Whitmore, had never felt more hopeful about the future. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it as part of a family bound not just by love, but by the shared determination to protect innocence and fight for what was right. The battle for their lives was about to begin, but tonight, love had already won its most important victory. The christening gown gleamed white against baby Sarah's tiny form as dawn broke over the defensive canyon where Jake had positioned their small force. Catherine had sewn the gown through the night from the remaining fabric of her wedding dress, her fingers working by lamplight while her husband and their allies prepared for battle. Now, as Vincent Harrow's hunting party approached through the morning mist, their daughter wore the symbol of hope and new beginnings into what might be their final confrontation. 12 riders, Frank Anderson reported from his position among the rocks above the canyon entrance, armed with rifles and moving like they mean business. Jake studied the approaching force through his field glasses, noting their formation and weapons with the practiced eye of someone who'd faced cavalry charges in the Shenandoah Valley. Professional soldiers, most of them. See how they're keeping. Interval and checking for ambush positions. These aren't just hired thugs. They're men who've seen real combat. Catherine cradled Sarah against her chest, the baby's presence a reminder of what they were fighting to protect. Despite giving birth less than 24 hours ago, she'd insisted on taking position where she could cover Jake's flank with the rifle Mary Anderson had taught her to use effectively. The pain of recent childbirth was a constant ache, but her determination burned brighter than any physical discomfort. "There!" Doc Henley whispered from his medical station behind a boulder that provided both cover and access to the wounded. "The man in front, that's got to be Vincent Harrow himself." Jake adjusted his focus and studied the lead rider, recognizing the cruel intelligence in the man's face, even at distance. Vincent Harrow was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of lean hardness that came from years of getting what he wanted through violence and intimidation. He rode like a man who'd never known defeat, his posture radiating the confidence of someone accustomed to crushing opposition through superior force. "He's brought enough men to storm a fort," Mary Anderson observed grimly, checking her own rifle from her position near the canyon's rear exit. "Question is, are we ready for them?" Jake's answer came in the form of tactical adjustments that spoke of experience earned in deadly combat. "Frank, when they reach that fallen log, start picking off the ones on the flanks. Mary, you watch our back trail. Harrow's smart enough to send men around if he can. Doc, stay low and be ready to move fast if we have to fall back." Catherine shifted Sarah to her left arm, freeing her right hand for the rifle Jake had positioned within easy reach. "What about me?" Jake met her eyes, seeing the fierce determination that had carried her through months of danger and the birth of their child. "You watch for Harrow himself. He's the key to everything. If we can take him alive, his men might surrender rather than face murder charges for killing federal witnesses." The battle began with the sharp crack of Frank Anderson's rifle, the sound echoing off canyon walls as one of Harrow's flanking riders tumbled from his saddle. The response was immediate and overwhelming. A concentrated volley of rifle fire that sent stone chips flying and forced the defenders deeper into their prepared positions. "They're good," Jake muttered, returning fire with careful precision. "But they're fighting uphill against prepared positions. That'll cost them." Vincent Harrow's voice carried clearly across the canyon, cultured and cold despite the violence erupting around him. "Catherine Whitmore, I know you're up there. Send down the documents and I'll make this quick and clean." Catherine's response was a rifle shot that missed Harrow by inches, the bullet sparking off rock near his horse's hooves. "My name is Catherine Morrison now, and the only thing you're getting from me is justice for every family you've destroyed." Harrow's laugh was genuinely amused. "Morrison, you married that dirt farmer? How wonderfully romantic and utterly pointless. Dead wives don't need wedding rings, my dear." Jake's return shot was more accurate, catching one of Harrow's men in the shoulder and spinning him from his saddle. "Keep talking, Harrow. Every word makes it easier to put a bullet where it needs to go." The firefight intensified as Harrow's men pressed their attack, using superior numbers to maintain constant pressure on the defenders' positions. But Jake's tactical positioning proved its worth. The narrow canyon approach forced the attackers into a killing field where their numerical advantage was negated by terrain and prepared defenses. Sarah began to cry as the gunfire grew louder. Her infant wails a heartbreaking counterpoint to the violence surrounding her. Catherine sang softly while returning fire, her voice a thread of humanity in the chaos of combat. "Hush, little baby, don't you cry," Catherine crooned between rifle shots. "Mama's going to sing you a lullaby." The incongruity of a lullaby sung over gunfire seemed to affect even Harrow's hardened killers, several of whom hesitated in their advance as the reality of what they were doing, attacking a new mother and her infant child, penetrated their professional detachment. It was Frank Anderson who spotted the flanking movement first. "Jake, 3 riders coming up the north slope. They're trying to get above us." Jake swung his rifle toward the new threat, understanding immediately that Harrow was attempting to turn their defensive advantage against them. If his men gained the high ground, the canyon that protected them would become a trap. "Catherine, take Sarah and get to the fallback position," Jake ordered, his voice carrying the authority of command under fire. "Doc, Mary, prepare to move." But Catherine Morrison had her own ideas about retreat. "No," she said firmly, settling Sarah into a protected alcove and taking up a better firing position. "We stand and fight together." Vincent Harrow was about to learn that some families couldn't be broken, no matter how much violence was brought to bear against them. Jake's cavalry saber caught the morning sunlight as he drew it from its worn leather scabbard, the blade singing a note of deadly promise that had once echoed across Virginia battlefields. The weapon had been his father's before him, carried through 3 years of civil war and kept sharp through decades of frontier life. Now it would taste blood again in defense of the family Jake had thought he'd lost forever. Vincent Harrow dismounted, 50 yards from the canyon mouth, his own sword gleaming as he advanced with the calculated confidence of a man who'd killed before and expected to kill again. Behind him, his remaining men maintained covering fire while Frank Anderson and Mary Morrison, Catherine had insisted on using her married name even in battle, held them at bay with disciplined marksmanship. "Enough!" Harrow called out, his cultured voice carrying clearly over the gunfire. "This ends between us, Morrison. Man to man, blade to blade. Winner takes everything. The woman, the child, and those damn documents that have caused me so much trouble." Catherine appeared at Jake's shoulder, her rifle trained on Harrow's chest. "Don't do it, Jake. He's trying to even the odds. Shoot him and end this." Jake considered the tactical wisdom of her suggestion, but something deeper than strategy was driving him now. Vincent Harrow had terrorized Catherine, had her thrown from a moving train while pregnant, had threatened to murder their newborn daughter. Some crimes demanded personal justice, sword in hand and eye to eye. "If I kill him from distance, his men fight to the death," Jake explained quietly. "If I beat him face to face, they might surrender." He kissed Catherine's forehead, tasting salt and gunpowder. Keep Sarah safe. Whatever happens, get her to California. Jake stepped into the open canyon floor, his saber held in the guard position his father had taught him as a boy. Harrow smiled with genuine pleasure, recognizing a worthy opponent in the rancher's steady stance and controlled breathing. You know how to use that blade, Harrow observed, beginning to circle with predatory grace. Military training. Enough to know you're favoring your left side, Jake replied, noting the almost imperceptible hesitation in Harrow's movement. Old wound or recent? Harrow's first attack came without warning, a lightning thrust aimed at Jake's heart that spoke of European fencing masters and expensive training. Jake parried barely in time, the impact sending shockwaves up his arm as steel rang against steel. The second exchange was faster, more vicious, with Harrow pressing his advantage in speed and technical skill. But Jake had learned sword work in a harder school. Frontier combat where losing meant death, not just wounded pride. He gave ground deliberately, drawing Harrow into the kind of close, brutal fighting that favored strength over finesse. Catherine covered Jake's flank with precise rifle fire, her shots keeping Harrow's men pinned while her husband fought for their lives in single combat. Baby Sarah lay quiet in her protected alcove, as if understanding that survival depended on silence. "Catherine!" A new voice called from the canyon entrance, causing everyone to freeze in shock. "Catherine, it's your father. I've brought federal marshals." Richard Whitmore rode into the canyon at the head of 6 blue-uniformed cavalry troopers, his face haggard with exhaustion and guilt, but his bearing straight with newfound resolve. Behind him rode a tall man whose badge identified him as a federal marshal, along with soldiers whose Spencer rifles were already trained on Harrow's scattered men. "Surrender your weapons," Marshal Porter commanded, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "You're all under arrest for kidnapping, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Harrow's men, seeing themselves suddenly outnumbered and facing federal troops, began laying down their rifles with the practical resignation of professionals who knew when a fight was lost. But Vincent Harrow himself only smiled, his blade never wavering from its guard position. "Too late, Marshal," Harrow said conversationally. "This is personal now. Your arrival doesn't change what needs finishing between Morrison and myself." "Vincent Harrow," Marshal Porter announced formally, "you're under arrest for crimes against the territorial government. Drop your weapon and surrender peacefully." "I think not." Harrow's next attack was desperate and deadly, a combination of thrusts and cuts that drove Jake backward toward the canyon wall. "I've built an empire through violence, Marshal. I'll not see it end in some territorial courtroom." Jake caught Harrow's blade on his guard and twisted, using the man's forward momentum to throw him off balance. In that split second of vulnerability, Catherine's quick thinking saved her husband's life. She spotted Harrow's hidden derringer, a small pistol concealed in his left hand, just as he brought it to bear on Jake's exposed back. Catherine's rifle shot took Harrow in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending the derringer flying into the rocks. Jake's saber found its mark a heartbeat later, the point taking Harrow through the chest in a thrust that ended both the fight and the criminal empire built on frontier corruption. Vincent Harrow fell to his knees, then forward onto his face, his blood seeping into Colorado soil that had already seen too much violence. The canyon fell silent, except for baby Sarah's soft breathing and the distant sound of federal troops securing Harrow's defeated men. "Is it over?" Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake sheathed his father's saber and pulled her into his arms, careful of the baby sleeping between them. "It's over, Catherine. We're free." Richard Whitmore approached hesitantly, his eyes fixed on the granddaughter he was seeing for the first time. "Catherine, I know I have no right to ask forgiveness, but—" "You came?" Catherine interrupted, tears streaming down her face. "When it mattered most, you chose us over your empire. That's enough, Father. That's enough." As federal marshals arrested the surviving members of Harrow's organization and secured the evidence that would ensure justice for his victims, the Morrison family stood together in the Colorado sunshine. Finally safe to begin the future they'd fought so hard to claim. The new land deed bore the crisp legal seal of the California territorial government, its elegant script declaring Jake and Catherine Morrison the rightful owners of 2,000 acres of fertile valley land near Sacramento. 6 months had passed since the confrontation in the Colorado Canyon, and the document represented more than property. It was Richard Whitmore's tangible attempt to atone for a father's betrayal, his gift of redemption written in soil and water. Rights. Catherine stood on the porch of their new home, baby Sarah gurgling contentedly in her arms as she watched Jake work with their small herd of cattle in the distance. The house was modest but solid, built of California redwood with a view that stretched across rolling hills to the Sierra Nevada mountains beyond. It was exactly the kind of place where a family could grow deep roots and build something lasting. "She's getting so big," Mary Anderson observed, bouncing Sarah gently while Catherine prepared dinner. The Andersons had arrived the week before, Frank having decided that California offered better opportunities than Colorado's played-out mining country. Their friendship, forged in violence and sealed in loyalty, had made the transition to peaceful life easier for all of them. 7 months old tomorrow, Catherine replied, stirring a pot of beef stew that filled the kitchen with the rich aroma of home cooking. Jake swears she's going to be walking before her first birthday. Through the window, they could see Jake demonstrating proper cattle handling techniques to Frank Anderson and 2 local ranchers who'd come to learn from the man whose reputation for fairness and competence was already spreading throughout the valley. Jake had adapted to prosperity with the same quiet dignity he'd shown in poverty, using his good fortune to help neighbors rather than distance himself from them. Doc Henley emerged from the parlor where he'd been examining the Anderson children, his medical bag in hand and his weathered face creased with satisfaction. "All healthy," he announced. "California air seems to agree with young folks better than Colorado altitude." The doctor had established a practice in nearby Sacramento, serving both the growing city and the surrounding ranch country. His presence in their lives remained a comfort to Catherine, a link to the dangerous times that had brought them all together, and the peaceful times that followed. "Any word from Marshal Porter?" Jake asked as he entered the kitchen, washing his hands in the basin while Catherine automatically handed him a towel. The domestic rhythm they'd developed spoke of deep partnership and mutual care. Letter came. "This morning," Catherine replied, producing the official correspondence from her apron pocket. "Vincent Harrow's trial concluded yesterday, guilty on all charges. 25 years in federal prison." Jake nodded with grim satisfaction. Justice delayed but not denied, and the families Harrow had destroyed could finally begin rebuilding their lives with compensation from his seized assets. "What about your father?" Mary asked quietly. Catherine's expression softened with complicated emotions. 2 years in territorial prison, reduced sentence for cooperation with federal authorities. He'll be eligible for parole in 18 months. She paused, watching Sarah play with her fingers. "He's been writing letters, wants to be part of Sarah's life when he's released." "And how do you feel about that?" Jake asked, his voice carefully neutral. Catherine considered the question while bouncing her daughter gently. "I feel like people can change, given proper motivation. My father chose his empire over his family once, but when it mattered most, he chose us. Sarah deserves the chance to know her grandfather, assuming he's truly learned from his mistakes." That evening, after the Andersons had returned to their own homestead and Doc Henley had ridden back to Sacramento, Jake and Catherine sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the California hills in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah slept peacefully in Catherine's arms, her tiny hand curled around her mother's finger in complete trust. "Do you ever miss Colorado?" Catherine asked, her voice soft in the gathering twilight. Jake considered the question while whittling. A toy horse from pine wood, his hands moving with the same careful precision he brought to everything he touched. "I miss the mountains sometimes. The way the air smelled after snow, the sound of wind in the pines." He set down his carving and looked at her seriously. "But I don't miss the loneliness. Don't miss waking up every morning wondering what the point was of getting out of bed. Catherine shifted Sarah to her shoulder and moved closer to Jake on the porch swing he'd built from California oak. What's the point now? Jake's smile was answer enough, but he put it into words anyway. The point is watching our daughter take her first steps, teaching her to ride a horse and read books and treat people with respect, building something good that'll last long after we're gone. He gestured toward the fertile valley spread before them. The point is all of this: family, purpose, hope for tomorrow. A year later, the Morrison Ranch hosted its first harvest celebration. Neighbors came from throughout the valley to share food and music and the satisfaction of another successful growing season. Jake played fiddle, while Catherine danced with baby Sarah, now taking confident steps between the chairs and tables set up in their front yard. Frank Anderson raised a toast as the evening wound down, his voice carrying clearly over the assembled crowd. To the Morrisons, who remind us that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as the worst. May your family grow as strong as your friendship. Catherine caught Jake's eye across the crowd and saw her own contentment reflected in his weathered face. They'd traveled a hard road to reach this moment, through violence and betrayal, childbirth and gunfire, the death of one dream and the birth of another. But they'd traveled it together, and the destination had proven worth every difficult mile. Later, that night, after the guests had departed and Sarah was sleeping soundly in her crib, Catherine found Jake on the porch with his journal, recording the day's events in his careful handwriting. "What are you writing?" she asked, settling beside him with the easy intimacy of long marriage. "Just thinking about how strange life is," Jake replied, setting down his pen and pulling her close. "A year and a half ago, I was a man with nothing to live for except the next day's chores. Now I'm a husband and father with more blessings than I know how to count." Catherine kissed his cheek and watched their daughter sleep through the window, safe and loved in the home they'd built together. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the best endings are really just new beginnings in disguise." Outside, the California stars shone down on the Morrison Ranch, where love had triumphed over corruption. Hope had conquered despair, and a family born from tragedy was writing its own story of redemption in the fertile soil of a new land.